For years, the pier carried the same sounds. The groaning wooden planks at low tide, the gulls circling like restless ghosts, and the gentle slap of water against barnacle-scarred posts. But among all these familiar textures of an aging seaside town, there was one presence that became as permanent as the tides themselves. A stray dog who waited, day after day, staring out across the gray-blue stretch of water as if expecting someone lost to the horizon. Locals called him Harbor, partly because he never left the pier, and partly because he seemed to be a place where sorrow docked and refused to sail away. He was a medium-sized mutt with fur that had once been golden but had since faded into a dull, sea-salted roughness. And though he had a slight limp and ribs that showed a little too clearly, there was a strange dignity in the way he carried himself. He was alone, but he was not defeated. Every sunrise, he would trot quietly to the very end of the pier, sit on his haunches, and stare straight ahead as though waiting for a ship that never came. Every sunset, he would curl beside the old coiled ropes, tuck his nose under his paw, and sleep without ever wandering far. Fishermen would toss him scraps, tourists would try coaxing him closer, and children would whisper stories about the mysterious dog who seemed frozen in time. But Harbor accepted these gestures without ever letting anyone become too close. He would take a piece of fish gently from a hand and step back immediately, returning to his silent vigil, ever watchful, ever patient. Nobody knew when he first appeared. Some said it was after a storm 3 years ago. Others claimed they'd seen him even earlier. But no matter how the story shifted, one thing remained constant. The dog was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. It wasn't hard to imagine why. Sometimes late at night, when fog swallowed the shoreline and the town's lights dimmed to faint orange glows, Harbor would whine softly toward the water, as though calling out to a voice only he remembered. His tail never wagged during these moments. His ears would fold back, and he'd lower his head, a posture that felt like mourning in its purest form. No one knew his story, but everyone could feel it. And yet the pier remained his world, a world that carried on without urgency or change, until one particular morning when an older man stepped onto the pier with the heavy tread of someone who had lived too many lives in silence. His name was Sergeant Daniel Hale, a retired veteran who had spent the last few months drifting through towns with no real destination in mind. He had no family waiting for him, no home he cared to return to, and no purpose pulling him forward. Only the habit of movement learned from decades of service. His hair was silver, trimmed short out of routine rather than pride, and his back carried the kind of stiffness that only years of duty could carve into bone. In his duffel bag were the essentials: old photographs he rarely looked at, medications he often forgot to take, and a weather-beaten journal filled with entries he tried but failed to complete. The pier was supposed to be just another stop for him, a place to breathe in the sharp ocean air before continuing his wandering without knowing why he was wandering at all. But as he walked toward the end of the pier, he noticed something unusual: a dog sitting unnaturally still, staring at the waves with a focus that felt almost human. Daniel slowed his steps, not because he was cautious of the dog, but because something about that posture, the waiting, the longing, hit him in a place he had spent years trying to seal shut. He recognized that look. He had worn it himself more times than he cared to admit. Harbor sensed the presence behind him and turned his head slightly, just enough for one brown eye to study the approaching stranger. Daniel expected the dog to bolt or at least stand up defensively, but Harbor simply lowered his gaze and returned to watching the water as if uninterested in any company that wasn't the one he had been hoping for all these years. Daniel took a slow seat on a weathered crate a few feet away. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He simply sat there, letting the wind thread through his jacket, letting the quiet settle, letting himself exist in the same space as a creature who clearly understood loss. Minutes slipped by, maybe longer, and for the first time in months, Daniel felt something shift within him, something small but undeniable. He wasn't alone, not truly. Harbor flicked an ear, but didn't move. The two of them stared out at the water together, not asking anything from one another, not offering anything either, just sharing the unspoken truth that both of them were waiting for someone who would never return. That morning passed like a whispered memory, and when Daniel finally stood to leave, he found Harbor watching him with curious, careful eyes. It wasn't trust, but it was the first crack in a wall both of them had carried for far too long. Daniel nodded once, an instinctive gesture of acknowledgement, and Harbor dipped his head in return, as if marking the moment too. Neither knew it yet, but everything changed the second their silences touched. Daniel Hale returned to the pier the next morning with the cold, sharp bite of autumn in the air, his boots crunching on the frost-tinged wood as he approached the spot where Harbor waited. The veteran had thought about the dog all night, replaying the brief interaction again and again, feeling a strange tug in his chest he hadn't experienced in years, a fragile, almost unbearable thread of connection. He didn't bring food or toys. He didn't try to coerce trust. He simply walked toward the edge of the pier, careful not to startle the dog, and sat down at a respectful distance. Harbor watched silently, tilting his head as if analyzing this new development with the patience only a creature who had spent years waiting could possess. Daniel felt the weight of his presence, a strange accountability forming between them, one unspoken yet undeniable. Hours passed in quiet company. The wind swept across the pier, carrying with it the tang of salt and the distant cries of gulls. Neither spoke, yet the conversation occurred in the subtle shifts of posture, the flicker of an ear, the slight wag of a tail, and the slow, deep exhale of a man who hadn't realized how tightly he had been holding on to his own loneliness. The veteran sensed something almost supernatural in the dog's vigilance, a consciousness beyond mere instinct. Harbor wasn't just waiting, he was guarding, observing, assessing, and in his silent manner, he seemed to understand more about Daniel than Daniel himself did. Daniel, in turn, felt compelled to share fragments of himself. He spoke of the barracks at dawn, of firefights and the deafening roar of helicopters, of nights spent staring at stars while wishing for the simplest form of human connection. He told Harbor about the injuries no one ever saw, the ones that couldn't be bandaged or medicated. The dog listened, never blinking, never moving except to adjust his position ever so slightly, leaning imperceptibly closer, as though absorbing each word. That day stretched on like a dream. The town moved around them, children ran along the shoreline, fishermen hauled in their catches, gulls dipped and wheeled, but on the pier, time slowed. By the next week, Daniel returned every morning without fail. He learned the rhythm of Harbor's vigil, the subtle shiver before the tide rose, the slight whine when a boat departed without cargo, the way his paws dug into the wood planks as though rooting himself to the pier itself. He also learned the dog's boundaries. When Daniel tried to extend a hand too quickly, Harbor would stiffen and retreat by inches, a silent lesson in patience and trust. And Daniel learned to wait. He had never been patient before, not in training, not in combat, not in the frantic nights after deployments where every sound set his nerves on edge. But here, on this wind-beaten pier, he found himself learning something he hadn't known he was capable of. A bond began to form in small, almost imperceptible increments. Harbor allowed Daniel to sit closer, to talk more freely, to touch his head gently without flinching. Daniel began leaving small blankets for the dog, checking that he had fresh water, observing his every action as if the creature were both fragile and indestructible at once. And slowly, as the weeks rolled into months, the dog did something remarkable. He began to anticipate Daniel's arrival. Each day, Harbor would walk to the pier entrance before Daniel appeared, pacing with a nervous energy he reserved only for these moments. It was a display of loyalty that cut through the veteran's defenses, a living testament to the patience and constancy Daniel had long forgotten. But Harbor's vigilance extended beyond mere companionship. One morning, after a particularly stormy night, Harbor ran past Daniel and stopped at a section of the pier that had been partially washed away during the tempest. He pawed frantically at a spot on the wood, whining sharply, eyes locked on the dark water below. Daniel followed him cautiously, heart pounding with the strange mixture of anticipation and fear. Harbor refused to move, nudging Daniel forward with his nose, barking insistently at a location Daniel couldn't yet comprehend. Trembling, Daniel peered over the edge, the storm-swept waves revealing a glimpse of something half buried beneath the water, a wooden box or crate that had been trapped beneath the pier for years, perhaps decades. His pulse raced as he took careful steps down onto the slippery planks, harboring both dread and hope, and reached down, hands shaking, heart hammering, to pull the box from its watery prison. Harbor circled him, barking once sharply, as if to say, "This is it, you found it, but it is not yours yet, you must understand." Daniel opened the crate with trembling fingers and discovered letters, photographs, personal effects, items that belonged to a man he thought he had lost forever. Each piece he lifted from the water-stained wood seemed to echo the void he had carried in his chest. Each photograph a reminder of a brother or a friend who had vanished, leaving grief as the only inheritance. The dog, finally releasing a low, relieved whine, nuzzled Daniel's hand. For the first time, the veteran understood that Harbor had not merely been waiting for the future, but had been leading him toward the past. The untold stories, the hidden truths, the fragments of a life lost at sea that had remained unseen yet never forgotten. The discovery was both a revelation and a burden, and Daniel realized that his bond with Harbor was no accident. The dog's years of patient waiting, his silent observation, his unwavering vigilance, they had all been in service to this very moment. They were companions bound by grief and redemption, by loss and discovery. And as the sun broke through the storm clouds that morning, painting the water in dazzling golds and silvers, Daniel felt something within him shift, the first stirrings of hope and the weight of destiny coalescing into the undeniable truth. He was no longer wandering aimlessly. He had been found, guided by a creature whose loyalty had withstood the tides of time, storms, and solitude. In the days that followed, Daniel could barely sleep, the weight of what Harbor had led him to unearthing pressing down on his mind with a mixture of grief and wonder. He returned to the pier every morning, but now there was more than waiting. There was purpose, a sense that the tides and the wind and the very creaking of the wood beneath his boots were guiding him towards something larger than himself. Harbor remained steadfast, always beside him, sometimes silent, sometimes pacing, eyes alert and ears flicking at the slightest sound. Daniel began to notice the smallest details, the way Harbor would glance toward the old storage shed at the edge of the pier, the way his paw would tap against a certain plank as if pointing out a path, the way his nose twitched at the scent of hidden things. Daniel realized that Harbor had been guiding him all along, not just to the crate they had found, but to something far more significant, a treasure hidden not in gold or jewels, but in history, in memories, in pieces of lives long forgotten. He felt an almost sacred responsibility to uncover every fragment, to honor the stories of those who had vanished and been left behind by time, neglect, and circumstance. Every morning, as the sun rose pale and soft over the horizon, Daniel would follow Harbor down forgotten alleys, across muddy docks, through long abandoned warehouses, and onto stretches of coastline that had been swallowed by decades of tides and storms. The dog's intuition was uncanny. Harbor would stop suddenly, ears raised, nose pointed in a direction Daniel could not yet see. Then, with a patient insistence, he would guide Daniel toward loose boards, hidden compartments, rusted trunks, or holes in the sand that held remnants of forgotten lives. Daniel began to catalog everything, recording notes in his weather-beaten journal, snapping photographs with a hand-me-down camera, and labeling every item with the care of a historian and the tenderness of a man learning again how to feel. There were letters tied in faded ribbons, photographs water-stained but still legible, journals with spidery handwriting chronicling moments of love, fear, joy, and despair. Every artifact told a story. Every object was a life whispered back into existence. And through it all, Harbor remained at Daniel's side, nudging him gently when he lingered too long in grief, standing guard when Daniel ventured too close to dangerous terrain, and giving a soft, approving whine whenever the veteran uncovered a particularly significant relic. What Daniel realized, slowly, was that the dog had not only been waiting for him at the pier, but had been waiting for the precise moment when he would be ready to carry the weight of these discoveries, to face the stories of loss and resilience that had been buried in silence for decades. One afternoon, after hours of sifting through a partially submerged rowboat, Daniel found a locked chest, its iron hinges rusted shut, but still resolute against time and tide. Harbor pawed at the lid with a frantic urgency, whining softly but insistently, as if to say, "You must open it. You are the one who can." With trembling hands, Daniel pried the chest open and revealed dozens of meticulously preserved documents, maps, and personal effects belonging to a small group of sailors who had mysteriously disappeared during a violent storm nearly 50 years ago. Among the artifacts was a logbook, its pages yellowed and corners frayed, detailing not only daily ship operations, but personal confessions, regrets, and fears. Daniel sat cross-legged beside the chest, running his fingers over the pages, reading names, dates, and stories that had been lost to history. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. Harbor had led him to not just forgotten possessions, but forgotten lives. These were people whose existence had been erased from memory, whose stories had been claimed by the sea in the passage of time, and yet here they were, breathing once more through the care of a veteran and a loyal dog. That night, as Daniel slept on a worn cot in his van, Harbor curled at his feet, Daniel felt a rare sense of peace. He understood that their bond was not merely companionship, not merely survival, but something sacred. Harbor's guidance had given him purpose, and in fulfilling that purpose, Daniel found healing in ways he had never thought possible. He dreamed of the pier, of rusted crates, of letters fluttering in the breeze, and of the watchful dog who seemed to know more about the tides of time than any human ever could. Morning came again, crisp and clear, and Daniel followed Harbor once more, this time toward an abandoned boathouse that had been overlooked for decades. The air was thick with the scent of brine and decay, but Daniel's heart raced with anticipation. Harbor led him to a section of the floor where planks had rotted and shifted, exposing a hollow beneath. The dog pawed eagerly at the entrance, nudging Daniel to peer inside. With careful precision, Daniel reached in and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were photographs of families he had never met, letters filled with hopes and fears, medals from conflicts long past, and journals filled with accounts of lives shaped by courage, sacrifice, and sometimes sheer misfortune. Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he realized the depth of the stories Harbor had guided him to. The dog nudged his shoulder gently, as if reminding him that he was not alone, that his grief and wonder were shared, that every discovery was a gift to be honored, not hoarded. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between Daniel and Harbor deepened further. The pier, once a lonely, desolate stretch of wood, became a sanctuary where stories were reclaimed and hearts were mended. Daniel's journal filled with meticulous notes, sketches, and photographs, documenting every finding. Harbor, for his part, remained ever vigilant, always watching, always waiting, guiding the veteran not merely to objects, but to the truths hidden beneath the surface of water, wood, and history itself. And as the weeks went on, Daniel began to realize the greatest treasure of all was not the chest of artifacts, not the documents and letters, not even the untold stories of lives nearly forgotten, but the bond he shared with a dog who had waited for years, whose loyalty and intuition had rewritten the course of his life, who had taught him patience, purpose, and the quiet, unwavering power of hope. By the time autumn had fully settled into the town, painting the pier and shoreline in muted oranges and deep browns, Daniel and Harbor had transformed the once quiet, almost forgotten stretch of waterfront into a place alive with purpose and story. Locals had begun to take notice, not of Daniel himself, who still carried the quiet, watchful air of a veteran accustomed to solitude, but of the pair as a unit, two beings so intertwined in loyalty and understanding that it was impossible to separate one from the other. Children would stop to watch as Harbor led Daniel along the edges of the pier, stopping to dig gently in the sand or to inspect a hollow under the weathered boards where some new fragment of history had been revealed. Sometimes fishermen would call out from their boats, "What's he found today?" But Daniel rarely responded, instead letting Harbor communicate for him. And Harbor, with his steadfast patience and almost uncanny intuition, seemed to know exactly how to convey discovery without a word. One morning, after a particularly stormy night, the waves had retreated to reveal a long buried pathway at the far end of the pier. Harbor's ears twitched, his body tense with anticipation. Daniel followed cautiously, sensing that whatever lay ahead was unlike anything they had encountered before. The pathway led to an old warehouse, its doors sagging, windows shattered, and the scent of salt, rust, and decay permeating the air. Harbor paused at the entrance, sniffing at the threshold as though confirming that this was the right place, that what had been hidden here for decades had finally been located. Daniel pushed the door open slowly, each hinge squealing in protest, revealing a dark interior scattered with crates, barrels, and the remnants of long-forgotten equipment. Dust swirled in the beams of sunlight that pierced through broken windows, and every step they took disturbed the memories of the place, a silent acknowledgement of the lives and labors that had once filled it. Harbor guided Daniel to a stack of crates in the far corner, pawing insistently at the floor beneath them. With careful effort, Daniel moved the crates and uncovered a trap door, warped and rusted but still intact. His heart pounded as he pried it open, revealing a staircase leading into darkness. Harbor waited at the top, tail flicking, ears forward, nudging Daniel down the steps with gentle insistence. Each step echoed through the hollow space, carrying the weight of anticipation and fear. At the bottom, they found a small underground chamber, perfectly preserved in its secrecy. The air was musty, tinged with the faint salt of the sea, but it carried the unmistakable presence of something long hidden. There were rows of shelves, carefully arranged, holding boxes, jars, and ledgers, treasures not of gold or jewels, but of human experience, of stories long buried by time. Daniel ran his hands over the items, uncovering photographs, letters, and keepsakes, each one telling a story of hope, struggle, love, and loss. He realized that this place had been a secret archive, a repository for the memories and belongings of generations who had worked on the waterfront, sailors, merchants, and townsfolk whose lives had otherwise been forgotten. Harbor barked softly, nudging Daniel toward a corner where a particularly old chest rested. With effort, Daniel opened it, revealing a collection of documents, journals, and photographs, detailing not just individual stories, but the entire history of the pier and the lives entwined with it. He felt tears well in his eyes, realizing the enormity of what they had uncovered. The dog sat patiently beside him, a silent witness and guide, acknowledging the significance of each discovery. Over the following days, Daniel carefully cataloged everything, photographing, recording, and preserving the fragile artifacts. Harbor stayed close at all times, sometimes leaning against Daniel's legs, sometimes pacing in quiet anticipation, his presence a constant reminder that every discovery was part of a larger story, one that only they could reveal together. As word began to spread among the townsfolk, curious onlookers would come by the pier, drawn by the quiet determination of the veteran and the unwavering loyalty of his dog. Some came to witness the discoveries, others to simply marvel at the bond between man and animal. Daniel rarely spoke to anyone beyond a nod or a brief explanation, letting Harbor take the lead, and through this, the dog became a symbol of patience, trust, and purpose. One particularly chilly morning, Harbor led Daniel to a portion of the warehouse floor that had been covered in sand and debris. He pawed frantically at a hidden compartment, barking softly but urgently. Daniel knelt down, removing the covering, and discovered a sealed box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were journals from a group of sailors who had vanished decades ago, detailing voyages, storms survived, friendships forged and broken, and the quiet, haunting moments of fear and longing that had accompanied them at sea. Daniel read the words aloud to Harbor, the dog listening intently, as though understanding the depth and weight of the stories. It became clear that Harbor's guidance had led them not merely to forgotten objects, but to the very essence of the lives that had shaped the pier and the community around it. Each discovery brought a new layer of understanding, a deeper appreciation for the intertwined histories of the town, the waterfront, and the lives touched by it. And Daniel, once a solitary figure wandering aimlessly, began to feel the first true sense of belonging in years. Harbor had not only led him to treasures of history and memory, but had led him back to himself, helping him to see that even in solitude, even in loss, connection and purpose could still be found. The veteran and his dog had become guardians, not just of the artifacts, but of the stories, the legacies, and the memories of countless lives. And as the sun set each evening, painting the water and the pier in deep crimson and gold, Daniel felt a profound gratitude toward the dog who had patiently waited for years, who had guided him unerringly, and who had shown him that the true treasure was not in the chest or the letters, but in the bond forged through loyalty, patience, and love. As winter crept over the town, the pier transformed once again, coated in frost and kissed by icy winds, yet it no longer felt like a desolate stretch of wood and rusted nails. To Daniel, it had become a sanctuary, a place where the past and present intertwined, a place where he and Harbor could continue their quiet mission of uncovering what had been hidden, lost, or forgotten. Each day began the same, the soft, persistent nudge of Harbor's nose, the gentle tug on Daniel's sleeve, and the unspoken command to move forward, to explore, to seek. The dog's eyes gleamed with the unshakable certainty that their purpose was not yet complete. Daniel had begun to understand that Harbor's instincts were guided not just by smell or intuition, but by an almost supernatural awareness of what needed to be found, of the threads of history that had been obscured by time, neglect, and human forgetfulness. One particularly cold morning, Daniel noticed Harbor circling near the edge of a crumbling warehouse, barking softly, ears erect, tail stiff. The dog's urgency was different this time, more insistent, more commanding. Daniel followed, boots crunching over frost-hardened sand, until they reached a section of the warehouse that had seemed unremarkable before. Here, the floorboards sagged dangerously, and a thin layer of dust concealed what Daniel would have otherwise walked past. Harbor pawed at the boards with careful persistence, whines escaping his throat, eyes locking onto Daniel as if to say, "This is it, you're ready." Daniel pried the boards loose, revealing a narrow tunnel beneath. The air was damp, musty, and tinged with the scent of salt and decay, but Daniel felt no hesitation. With Harbor at his side, he descended, guided by the dog's unwavering presence. The tunnel opened into a hidden chamber, larger than any space they had yet discovered. Light from a small broken window filtered in, illuminating rows of shelves, stacks of crates, and chests that had lain untouched for decades. Daniel felt his heart race, realizing the magnitude of what lay before him. Harbor's tail wagged once, twice, then stilled, his eyes fixed on a particular chest near the far wall. Daniel approached cautiously, hands trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside, he found a treasure trove of personal histories, artifacts that spoke of lives full of dreams, tragedies, and triumphs. There were journals chronicling voyages lost at sea, letters between loved ones torn apart by distance and war, photographs capturing fleeting smiles and fleeting moments, medals from acts of bravery, and even delicate trinkets, watches, rings, and charms that carried the weight of generations. Daniel's eyes blurred with tears as he sifted through each item, recognizing the importance of preserving these stories. Harbor nudged him gently, a reminder that while the discoveries were monumental, their mission was about honoring the lives behind them, ensuring that none would be forgotten. Weeks turned into months as Daniel cataloged, photographed, and carefully restored the fragile artifacts. Harbor never left his side, always alert, always guiding, sometimes standing guard when Daniel became lost in sorrow or wonder. Through this process, Daniel began to heal in ways he had never imagined. The isolation he had felt during his years of wandering vanished, replaced by purpose, connection, and the deep satisfaction of uncovering stories that needed to be remembered. The townspeople, who had once regarded the veteran and his dog with curiosity or indifference, now approached with reverence and awe. They marveled at the discoveries, listened intently as Daniel shared the recovered histories, and began to understand the profound impact of Harbor's guidance. The dog, once a mere companion, had become a symbol of intuition, loyalty, and unwavering devotion, a living bridge between the past and present. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep purple and fiery orange, Daniel and Harbor stood at the edge of the pier, gazing out at the water. The crates, journals, letters, and artifacts had been safely stored in a local museum, their stories now accessible to the world, ensuring that those long forgotten would finally be remembered. Daniel ran a hand along Harbor's sleek fur, feeling the warmth and steadfastness of his companion, and whispered softly, "We did it, buddy. We found them all." Harbor leaned into him, eyes gentle, tail thumping softly against the frozen boards, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had undertaken together. In that moment, Daniel realized that the true treasure had never been the artifacts themselves, nor the forgotten chests or letters. It had been the bond forged between man and dog, the unwavering companionship that had guided him from despair to purpose, from isolation to belonging. Harbor had waited at the pier for years, patient and vigilant, knowing that one day Daniel would arrive, that together they would uncover the hidden stories of the past, and in doing so, rewrite the course of their own lives. As winter deepened, Daniel continued his work, honoring the memories, cataloging new discoveries, and sharing the recovered stories with all who would listen. Harbor remained at his side, ever watchful, ever faithful, guiding him forward, reminding him that even in the darkest winters, hope could be found, stories could be reclaimed, and lives, even those long gone, could leave an indelible mark on the present. The pier, once silent and desolate, now echoed with the footsteps of discovery, the whispers of history, and the quiet, steadfast loyalty of a dog who had waited faithfully, shaping the destiny of a man who had once wandered alone. And in the stillness of the night, as the wind carried the salt and cold over the water, Daniel knew with absolute certainty that Harbor had given him the greatest gift of all, the understanding that every life, every story, and every heart, lost or forgotten, could be found again, so long as one had patience, love, and a faithful companion to guide the way.